Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to our report launch discussing the historical roots of climate vulnerability and their impact on marginalized communities. I'm Neïla Maïza. I'm Manushya Foundation Corporate Accountability Advisor, and I'll be your host for today's insightful discussion hosted by Manushya Foundation. For those who don't know us, Manushya Foundation powers women, youth, and marginalized communities across Asia, focusing on democracy, access to justice, corporate accountability, climate justice, and digital rights. As the world is facing the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution and waste, some communities are more vulnerable to it than others due to historical and structural inequalities. Manushya's new flagship report, From Colonial Exploitation to Climate Vulnerability, a legacy of injustice for marginalized communities, non-economic loss and damage in Asia and the Pacific, explores such inequalities, from colonization to extractivism and discrimination, and the impact marginalized communities are facing today. Across Asia and the Pacific, communities are losing more than homes and livelihoods. They are losing languages, cultures, ancestral knowledge, and spiritual ties to nature. These are non-economic loss and damage, intangible and irreversible negative impact of climate change that are priceless and cannot be easily compensated. Today, the author of the report, Delasari Krisda Putri, will present the findings and recommendations, and three experts and community leaders, Cressida Kuala, Surya Deva, and Patricia Miranda Wattimena, will react to the report, sharing their reflections and insight on such important issues. It is my great pleasure to welcome and introduce our speakers. Cressida Kuala, you are the founder and CEO of the Porgera Red Wara Women's Association, an organization that works to denounce and document the problems faced by women impacted by the Porgera mine in Papua New Guinea. You are an Indigenous Ipili Porgera woman, a woman human rights defender, and an environmental activist from a coal mining town in the highland of Porgera, Enga province in Papua New Guinea. Surya Deva, you are the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development since 2023. You are a professor at the Macquarie Law School and the director of the Center for Environmental Law at Macquarie University, Australia. You conduct research on the area of business and human rights, comparative constitutional law, international human rights law, sustainable development, climate change, and gender equality. Patricia Miranda Wattimena, you are a Malaysian Indigenous feminist from Maluku. At ESCR-Net, you are accountable to ensure a social movement centered and shared leadership among members of the Environment and ECR Working Group. Prior to ESCR-Net, you led the climate justice team and broader advocacy work of different membership-led Indigenous and feminist networks across Asia and the Pacific. You studied criminal law, but more importantly, you are shaped by your community's legacy of political resistance against climate colonialism and the ongoing struggle of Indigenous sovereignty and liberation. And last but not least, Dela Krisda Putri, you are the author of the report and a former corporate accountability and climate justice fellow at Manushya Foundation. You are currently engaged in advancing corporate accountability and addressing forced labor issues in Southeast Asia. You collaborate with several NGOs to power local civil society organizations and provide critical support to workers. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. It's a great honor to have you on this panel. So let's start with you, Dela. What struck the most in the report is the historical colonial legacies you describe. Could you share with us about the report's finding on the root causes of communities' vulnerability to climate change? What role did colonization truly play?
Sure. Can you hear my voice clearly, Neïla?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you so much, Neïla, for the introduction, and for everyone here who are really expert, and also the community leaders. I'm really honored to be here as well. And if I'm being honest, that this report is inspired by the report from the Prof. Surya Deva. So I would like to thank you very much for the invaluable report that become an inspiration from for this report as well. So coming back from for the question from Neïla, of course, I would like to share with you about the main finding of this report. I think Neïla already emphasized that across our region in Southeast Asia and also Asia Pacific, communities already bear the least responsibility, but they are um, they are on the front lines, but also they are facing the impacts quite really high, and they are doing these with the fewest resources to prepare or even to recover. And these communities include indigenous people, ethnic minorities, fisher, or even other rural and marginalized groups. They are often facing intersection forms of discrimination based on gender, race, class, age, and even ability, which make them even more vulnerable to the loss and damage that is stem from the climate change. So the report today that launched today is aimed to identify why these communities are so vulnerable, not only to climate change, but also to non-economic loss and damage, such as the loss of culture, identity, and land, which become the central issues in this report. And the core finding was quite clear that the colonization played a critical role in building the foundation of the crisis we are facing today. And how this can happen, actually, we already explored in the report that for over 5 centuries, from 15th to 20th centuries, the European colonial powers from the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, they exploited many colonized people, lands, and resources that has aimed to expand their wealth and power. However, their action in the colonization often established based on the extractive economies and based on the exploitation of natural resources. Yet for these greedy colonial states, the nature was entirely viewed as a mere commodity. So therefore, it led to the exploitative and destructive resource extraction because they were often carried out the exploitation with minimal regard and even sometimes outright disregard for the local environment. So building upon this exploitative foundation that laid by the colonialism, the Industrial Revolution that become accelerated environmental degradation, even deepened climate inequities on a global scale. So it was also fueled by the intense extraction that is oftenly happen in the colonized countries and territories by burning of fossil fuels such as coal or oil, which eventually resulted in the massive greenhouse gas emission that leading cause of today's climate crisis that we are facing. And this actually can be seen from some large-scale deforestation that become institutionalized in the past. For instance, under British control, India, there was mass and fast clear expanses of oak and the other forests in the Himalayas in the late 18th for pine plantation, and this contributed to the widespread wildfires every summer till now. Similarly, also in Indonesia, like the Dutch colonial power also promoted large-scale deforestation, especially in the northern coast of Java, including locations such as Rembang, Jepara, and Pekalongan. This disrupted traditional land stewardship and even intensify ecological vulnerability. And this legacy is actually um, still experiencing by today in the region's susceptibility to climate disasters. So the climate challenge we face today are actually the predictable consequences of an ecologically unequal exchange between the global majority and also the global minority. as classified by the UN Framework Convention on the Climate Change, that they mention that almost 92% of cumulative carbon emission is actually stem from the exploitation, prioritization of profit, consumerism, and also colonialism control over peoples and the environment. So when colonial empires got richer and benefited from technological advancement, colonized people, which include many marginalized communities, were left with the environmental degradation and also economic exploitation. So yes, absolutely, that the colonization not only contributed to climate vulnerability, but also it entrenched it. So its legacies continue to limit the resilience for former colonies, that they are still dependent on the climate sensitive and extractive sector. For example, in the small island developing states in the Pacific, they rely on the narrow and fragile resources basis like monoculture plantation, while being subject for the international trade, they are still coupled with the debt stress, and also it become worse because there is still volatility due to the fluctuation in the raw materials, and more often is about the financial access that prevent them from diversifying their economies. And further, the report also highlighted that the climate change does not only destroy buildings or roads that can calculate in terms of economy, but also it involves the loss of culture, languages, tradition, biodiversity, which really also important, same as the economic loss and damage. And its displacement, trauma, and deaths is also experiencing by them. So climate change, it's also hits the core of the identities of communities. For instance, in the report, we have several case studies, such as in Indonesia, we mentioned the Bajo tribes tradition, that they are actually having a deep connection with the sea, but now because of the climate change, they are threatened by the occurrence of the extreme weather events. So sea is something that is really important for them, but because of this extreme weather, it's complicating the daily activities that they used to be. So, for instance, um, they threaten by the tradition that they usually have to sustain them for a generation, need to be reevaluate because of the increasingly difficult on the survival mode in the sea that is near where they are living now. So it leads to the loss of the intangible cultural assets such as the oral histories, rituals, and even customary laws that tie to the seas. Another example is in Vanuatu. I think the rising sea levels, cyclones, and also landslide are also forcing indigenous communities living there to relocate from their ancestral lands. The displacement has already brought diverse linguistic groups into closer proximity, leading to a decline in the use of indigenous languages and, of course, the erosion of the linguistic diversity at the end. This is why the report is becomes so important, because climate justice must go beyond emission reduction and finance, but it must include holding historically responsible actors to account. And we also must to address the ongoing consequences of the colonialism and also ecological exploitation that already done in the past, but we are still experiencing today. So that means that we have to recognize and respond to the non-economic loss and damage, which consists of cultural, spiritual, or even any kind of loss and damage that makes the communities become more vulnerable. So we are here with the report come to denounce that the rooted in the colonialism and its enduring non-economic impacts on vulnerable communities that is faced by the communities in the Asia and the Pacific is actually disproportionate. And we would like to highlight that the historical exploitation by the global minority is actually perpetuates inequalities and also undermine the rights, identities, and also the livelihoods of the most affected. So I think that's all, like the main findings of the report. Thank you so much, Neïla.
Thank you, Dela, for this overview. As you said, climate justice is not just about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's really acknowledging the legacy of the past of colonialism, extractivism, and holding those historically responsible accountable. And it's also about fair and just reparation for the global majority. I'd like now to turn to Cressida. As a brave Indigenous woman, human rights defender, denouncing the impact of mining in Papua New Guinea, would you like to comment on our report and draw a parallel with the situation in your country?
Thank you, Neïla. Thank you, Dela, and thank you, Surya. This is a very important area for me that I've been raising this issue for 15 years now, and it is a great opportunity, and I would like to thank all of you for putting this together for me to be here to speak about my view of the report. And it's evening here, and I'd like to say good evening, everyone. As Neïla has already introduced me, my name is Krisda. I am an Indigenous Porgera woman from Papua New Guinea. I'm deeply honored to be here at this launching of the Manushya report from Colonial Exploitation and Climate Vulnerability, a legacy of injustice for marginalized communities, non-economic loss and damage in Asia and the Pacific. My contribution to this discussion comes from a deeply personal place, as I will share a bottom-up perspective on the intertwined legacies of colonization and extractivism, particularly as they manifest in my home, focusing on the Porgera gold mine in Papua New Guinea. This is a story of unearned grievances, of a pursuit of wealth that has overshadowed human rights, environmental stewardship, and culturally appropriate avenues for justice, directly contributing to non-economic loss and damage. The enduring shadow of colonization and extractivism is the first topic that I would like to elaborate. It is an area where, to understand the situation at Porgera, we must first acknowledge the enduring shadow of colonization. Papua New Guinea is a nation of incredible diversity, and its destiny fundamentally reshaped by external powers. The imposed governance and legal frameworks, while intended to establish order, often fail to respect our complex customary laws. This top-down model inadvertently laid the groundwork for future exploitation, prioritizing extractivism. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. The second area is about extractivism. Is a modern manifestation of these colonial practices. In Papua New Guinea, we have seen this pattern repeated tragically from the Panguna mine in Bougainville, which began operations in 1972, preceding Porgera, to the Porgera gold mine itself. For over 30 years, the Porgera gold mine has extracted immense wealth, enriching multinational corporations like Barrick, PJV, and the Xing Chinese group of companies. Indeed, the Bougainville crisis ignited by grievances related to the Panguna mine's legacy of gross human rights violations and environmental degradation, even influenced the rapid opening of the Porgera gold mine in 1989. Yet this world has come at an unbearable cost: gross human rights violation and severe environmental degradation. This pattern, where benefits flow outwards and burdens remain inwards, directly mirrors the historical exploitation inherent in colonial enterprises. The story of Porgera gold mine and Panguna mine oversee and unaddressed grievances. The indigenous communities have endured forced displacement, loss of livelihoods, sexual violence, especially women and young girls who were raped and peg raped, and the systematic suppression of dissent. The environmental destruction has been equally catastrophic, directly impacting the health and cultural practices of our people. Failure to protect, and the third area that I would share with you is failure to protect and respect our human rights. The unseen costs. What is most galling is the consistent failure of all levels of government in Papua New Guinea to protect their own citizens. Despite repeated appeals, protesters, and documented evidence, our pleas for culturally appropriate remedy have been met with indifference, if not outright hostility. The very institutions meant to safeguard our rights have, through their inaction, become complicit in our suffering. This failure by our government is paralleled by the failure of multinational corporations to respect indigenous people's rights. Agreements often drafted top-down have disempowered local communities from meaningful participation, undermining free, prior, and informed consent. Companies have operated with perceived impunity. Their corporate social responsibility initiatives are superficial, failing to address these deep-seated legacy issues and ongoing injustices. This systematic disrespect is a direct affront to international human rights standards and a stark reminder of the power imbalances inherited from colonial structures. As I reflect on my own words, a voice of the voiceless, I feel both pride in our melanesian way of life and profound sadness and anger. The pain of Porgera and Panguna mines exemplifies what happens when corporate greed overrides human rights, environmental protection, and their justice. This directly relates to the concept of non-economic loss and damage, the irreparable harm to our culture, our identity, our spiritual connection to land, and the loss of traditional knowledge and communal well-being, which cannot be compensated by financial means alone. Why injustice makes us more vulnerable to climate change, linking to non-economic losses and damages. The fourth part of the area that I would like to share. This is the crucial link to the Manushya report's theme. All these injustices, human rights violations, environmental degradation, and the lack of remedy make us indigenous peoples profoundly more vulnerable to climate change. It is a vicious cycle where one problem exacerbates the next, severely diminishing our capacity to survive and adapt. And the fifth part is losing our food and ways of life. Mine destruction and river pollution strip us of our traditional food sources and self-sufficiency. This creates dependence and leaves us extremely vulnerable when climate change brings droughts or floods, denying us safe food and eroding our natural adaptive capacities. This is a direct non-economic loss of traditional livelihood and food securities, forgetting our whole knowledge when our voices are ignored and our lands are irrevocable. Changed, we lose our traditional ecological knowledge. This invaluable knowledge about nature, weather patterns, and sustainable living passed down through generations is vital for climate adaptation. Without it, we become helpless in the face of changing conditions. This is an immense non-economic loss of culture, heritage, and adaptive capacity. Sickness and broken communities is the seventh area where the impacts of mining and exposure to climate change that needs to be driven in community level. The trauma from abuses coupled with pollution-induced illnesses, weaknesses our people, forced displacement fragments communities and eroding trust and solidarity. When government fails to provide justice, internal divisions grow, make it harder to collectively respond to climate disasters. This represents profound non-economic loss in social cohesion, mental well-being, and community resilience. We also need to elaborate on no land, no future. That is how we see after a mining devastation that had caused displacement. The most fundamental loss is that of our ancestral lands. Our land is our mother, our identity, our spirit. If it is taken and destroyed, we have nowhere to go. We cannot live up in the sky to come down and collect food from the land and go back up there. It's impossible. When climate change makes our homes unsafe, without our connection to the land, our spirit to fight and adapt is critically weakened. This is the ultimate non-economic loss, the severing of our spiritual and cultural connection, the loss of self-determination, determination, and the very foundation of our existence. This prolonged injustice has stripped away our inherent strength, making us disproportionately suffer the impacts of climate change. Our increased vulnerability is not just a consequence of bad weather, it is a direct result of centuries of colonial and extractive exploitation. The legacy of colonization and extractivism at Porgera in PNG is a powerful, at Porgera and Bougainville is a powerful cautionary tale for all of us in Papua New Guinea and across the Pacific and Oceania. It urgently demands paradigm shift that prioritizes human rights, environmental justice, and culturally appropriate mechanisms for remedy. Our Indigenous perspectives offers a unique and vital lens for us. Land is not merely a commodity, it is our mother, our identity, our spirituality, and the repository of ancestors' wisdom. Its violation is a spiritual assault, a direct attack on the very fabric of our communities and our intergenerational well-being. The struggle at Porgera is a microcosm of a larger regional imperative to decolonize development, reclaim our sovereignty over our resource and asset, our right to self-determination. The similar long-standing injustice faced by communities affected by the Panguna mine in Bougainville underscore that these are not isolated incidents, but systematic issues that require comprehensive and just redress. Let us, the people of Pacific and Oceania and the Asia, embrace our unique perspectives to forge a new path, one that honors our heritage fiercely, protects our environment, and ensures that the wealth of our lands truly benefits our own people. This is not just a plea, it is a solemn commitment to our shared future, guided by the wisdom of our ancestors and enduring resilience of our spirit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cressida, for sharing the story of the community, for those powerful words. We stand in solidarity with what the community has been and is being facing today. The struggle faced by Indigenous peoples in Papua New Guinea is another example of the intertwined, as you said, legacies of colonialization and extractivism, and it shows the impact of communities' climate change resilience, and it illustrates the urgent need for a decolonial approach to development. So now I'm turning to you, Professor Deva. As the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development, I would like you to comment, reflect on the report, and tell us more about this intersection between colonization, the right to development, often seen as a decolonial movement by many activist, and non-economic loss and damage.
Thank you very much, Neïla, and it's really a great pleasure to be part of this report launch panel with the author Deva and of course Cressida and Patricia. So wonderful to be here. I would also like to thank Manushya for not only the invitation but also for thinking about this critical theme of the report, and congratulate them as well as Deva for this excellent report. In my view, it's a very important report, and good to know that my last year report created some trigger, some inspiration for that. From my perspective, three aspects of the report stand out, and I will kind of extend some of the things that are there in the report for our consideration. The first is the report makes the colonial connections to climate change very clear. And these are connections with multiple strands, and the report exposes some of these strands of the colonial connections to climate change and climate justice. But there are other aspects as well which could further be explored and expanded, in my view. The second aspect of this report is it exposes and highlights the intersectional dimensions to climate change, not only in terms of the impacts, how people experience impact differently, but also the responses have to be different based on who they are, whether these are persons of disability, or these are women, or these are children, or indigenous peoples, So I think that dimension is very crucial. And the third is the report underscores the importance of non-economic loss and damage. And I think this issue of non-economic loss and damage creates a lot of challenges. First challenge is that when we talk about loss and challenge, we're talking about quantification normally. How much is lost? So that can be compensated. But it is very difficult to quantify easily this particular issue about non-economic loss. And I think Cressida hinted about it, like how much value indigenous peoples would like to put on their land, ancestral land. What is the value of loss of culture or language? So I think that issue becomes a very difficult issue, both at the normative level, should we put a value for such non-economic losses, but also in terms of quantification, attribution, and all that. So that's a major challenge. But let me go back to the first colonial connections aspect a bit. The report documents very well the exploitation of people as well as the resources for centuries that has created the situation where we are today. But I think I would also like to add to that there are other dimensions to it, and that one dimension which we can expand further, in my view, is the continuous export of hazards, waste, and also manufacturing and production to the global south. Of course, the report does not use global south, they use global majority and global minority, but I'm using global south as an umbrella term to capture those particular threats. So if you look at the plastic pollution, for instance, or even the shipping that is being dismantled after their life is over, they're all being exported to the global south. So whether these are hazardous chemicals or plastic waste or ship dismantling, and these are just examples of it. So in my view, this is again highly problematic. And this is again reflective of neo-colonial structures of economy, in which the risks are passed on to the global south. Often we talk about Asia is very polluted, but we don't go to the root causes. Why Asia is polluted? Asia is polluted because we are the factory of the world. So Europe and the global north is benefiting from the pollution of Asia, and we don't factor that into account when we talk about the economic models. The other issue which I think we can expose further is this colonial models and history also destroyed the focus on collective and the community in which we lived. The Western idea or the neoliberal idea of free market economy is focused on an individual. It is about me. It's I that matters. It's not the collective. It's not the society. It is not the community. It is not the collective that matters. And they create this disjunction between self and nature. But for many people living in this part of the world, there's no distinction between self and nature. We are part of the nature. So this harmony with the nature, which indigenous peoples have preserved for centuries, was also destroyed by the colonial structure and the economic model. And I think we can expose some of these aspects as well. That's why the whole focus on consumerism and all that. Now, let me allude to the second part of your question, Neïla, if I could, about right to development, that what value the right to development discourse can bring to fight against this colonial structure and the colonial contribution to climate injustice. In my report of last year on climate justice, I articulated 4 pillars and 12 principles. I will not have the time to go through those, but I will invite the participants to this webinar to glance through the report if you have not done so. But let me quickly mention 4 or 5 principles very briefly that of right to development, which are relevant. First is self-determination, and Cressida outlined this. It's very critical that people collectively, not just the governments, but people collectively are able to determine what kind of a development they want. And I think that is what is not happening at this particular point of time. It's a very top-down model of development in which people are merely recipient of development. They are not creating, they are not co-creating what kind of a model of development they want. And as part of my mandate, I'm trying to push back against this model, and I'm proposing that we should move towards more planet-centered, participatory model of development in which the bottom-up approaches are crucial. The second principle is intergenerational equity. So the issues that we are discussing today are not relevant merely for us, the current generation. As I often remind everyone, we are just participant in this relay race. There were previous generation who lived in this planet, and there'll be others who will come on this planet. So I think we are trustees, and we have to pass this baton to other future generation people. And I think that's where right to development provides this intergenerational aspect very crucial. Third is intersectionality, and I will just mention it because the report does a good job of highlighting it, so I will not go deeper into it. The fourth is fair distribution. We often think that developing countries are poor, but we don't go to the colonial roots of that. Why are these countries are poor, and why certain countries are more rich and developed? And I think that is where the economic model is creating a lot of inequalities, not only within countries, but among countries. And I think we need to challenge that and also address that particular issue. And again, right to development provides a pathway to do that. And finally, international cooperation. When we talk about climate justice, not merely access to finance, and I would say finance more in terms of the grant so that the debt burden is not increased. But in addition to that, we also need technical know-how. We need new technologies, and some of these technologies may not be in the global south. And I think that is where international cooperation becomes crucial. Technological transfer will be crucial. So I think this is the time to pay back for the colonial exploitation through this international cooperation, in my view. That is the idea of reparation, which I articulated in my report as well. And I think, I hope all of us can work together to build a movement to address these historical injustices. Thank you very much once again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for your valuable comments on the intersection of those critical issues. I really want to highlight the neo-colonial structures with this idea of, yes, exporting the manufacturing, exporting the waste. Colonialism is not something from the past. It is really still very accurate to this day. And we have structures that are put in place to sustain this model. that is detrimental to a lot of communities in the global majority countries. Now that we have heard about the devastating impact of colonialism on the planet and affected communities, Dela, could you please tell us more about the solutions that we are proposing in the report? What are the report's recommendations to ensure communities are at the table? How can we make sure that Indigenous peoples and those most impacted by non-economic loss and damage are included and are leading climate action and policymaking?
Sure, thank you, Neïla. So I think we've already heard about the profound impacts to the climate change towards the Indigenous communities by also hearing from Cressida. And while that is become really profound, I think the non-economic loss and damage is still become a critical issue because of several challenges, like Prof. Surya Deva mentioned, the measurement, the calculation, valuation, and also in terms of the communication and decision making. So I think to address some of these challenges in the report, we identifies 4 key recommendations to ensure that people-centered integration of non-economic loss and damage. First is, of course, it's still relevant to the self-determination that both Cressida and also Prof. Surya mentioned. I think it's about strengthening the community capacity to inform decision making. So the local communities here must be powered to actively participate in not only identifying the what causes, but also they need to inform what they need in terms of addressing the non-economic loss and damage to ensure that the responses are grounded in the local needs and aspiration. So it means that people or communities that is being affected by the climate justice are heard and also participate in terms of several information. For example, access to information for the local communities is really important. So it requires accessible data, tools, and resources so that the communities can be supported by the evidence-based solution. And the second one is we mentioned about the integrating non-economic loss and damage into decision-making on adaptation policies. So it means that we have to embed consideration of the non-economic loss and damage into not only international, but also national strategy as a holistic and effective way of decision-making. So here we highlight that the policymakers must develop tools and guidelines to incorporate non-economic loss and damage into risk assessment, into the funding allocation, and also into the resilience strategies. So by doing these, like cross-sector collaboration, I think it will equally vital to ensure that the non-economic loss and damage can be reflected into broader social, environmental, and development policies. And of course, to ensure that the policies is inclusive and equitable for communities. And the third is to create a comprehensive international policy framework to address the non-economic loss and damage. We mean here by developing a robust international framework because it is the key to address the complexities and diverse forms of the non-economic loss and damage, especially across cultural, social, and also geographical contexts. So this framework must prioritize contextual sensitivity because they need to recognize the unique experience of harm that is really different in each communities. So rather than imposing rigid and standardized definition, they need to be sensitive, contextual based, so that the loss and damage fund also must include the non-economic loss and damage related intervention, such as supporting displaced communities based on the communities' participacy, and also safeguarding cultural heritage, or even addressing mental health or well-being that is that is experienced by the communities. And the last is about commitment at the COP30. I think this is also really important because parties must formally acknowledge that the non-economic loss and damage is a central issue in the climate discourse, and they need to translate this into specific action and ensuring that the climate policies are inclusive, resilient, and also responsive to the full spectrum of climate impacts, and also prioritizing the communities, the indigenous communities who are bearing the really worst experience in the climate change. I think that's all the recommendation that we are highlighting in the report, Neïla. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing those. Yeah, as you said, non-economic loss and damage can no longer be sidelined in climate negotiations, and they demand acknowledgement and a bottom-up, community-centered integration into policy decision-making process as a central element for justice and equity. Thank you. Krisda, do you agree with our recommendations, and based on your experience fighting for climate justice, what would be your recommendations to ensure Indigenous people's voices are at the center of climate change related policy making?
I think it sounds similar, but I would like to stress a little bit on the recommendations that I have came up with after thinking of preparing for this launch, and it's very important that I share the ideas that I need to share with the team. One is to prioritize and empower Indigenous society, as Dela said, people from Indigenous society, governance structure in decision making by the governments and corporations must recognize and respect formally integrate Indigenous governance structures, example, the tribal councils, the clan leaders, community elders, into stages of resource development and dispute resolutions. This ensures that local communities who are the customary landowners have a direct and influential say in decisions affecting their ancestral lands and resources, moving beyond tokenistic and resources moving beyond resources moving beyond tokenistic consultations to genuine power sharing. And number two is implement free, prior, and informed consent as a non-negotiable standard. The principle of free, prior, and informed consent must be upheld rigorously and genuinely for all projects impacting Indigenous lands and resources. This means communities have the right to give or withhold their consent without questions, based on comprehensive and accessible information, and at every stage of a project, existing agreements lacking genuine FPIC must be reviewed and renegotiated with meaningful community participations, because that is the stage where I'm, as a woman leader, I'm finding difficulties to move forward to voice issues from a point of women's views. And as the Porgera gold mine is going through renegotiation with the government and the stakeholders, it is a little bit difficult for me to bring these recommendations to the national platform. And the third is establish and fund culturally appropriate remedy mechanisms. That is one problem that we need fundings, and the government, while the government and the companies see us as antagonists, it is very difficult because we need to develop and adequately fund culturally appropriate remedy mechanisms that go beyond financial compensation. This mechanism should be designed and led by Indigenous communities, incorporating customary laws, restorative justice practices, and processes that facilitate spiritual healing, environmental restorations, and the revitalization of cultural heritage. They should address both individual and collective harm, including non-economic loss and damage. And the fourth recommendation is recognized and value traditional ecological knowledge for environmental stewardship. Formally recognizes and integrate traditional ecological knowledge into environmental impact assessments, mitigation strategies, and climate adaptation plans. Indigenous knowledge systems offer invaluable insights into sustainable land management, biodiversity, conservation, and climate resilience. This ensures that environmental protection efforts are contextually relevant and effective while empowering Indigenous communities as custodians of their lands. And the fifth and the final is strengthen legal frameworks to uphold Indigenous rights and corporate accountability. Advocates for an enact national and regional legal reforms that explicitly codify and enforce Indigenous people's right as articulated in the international instruments like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These frameworks must include robust mechanisms for corporate accountability, ensuring multinational corporations are legally bound to uphold human rights and environmental standards and face severe penalties for violations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cressida, for sharing your recommendation and highlighting the need to recognize Indigenous people leadership, the rights of Indigenous people in general, but with preparing from consent by being very central. The importance as well of culturally appropriate remedy and the recognition of traditional knowledge and stewardship. And of course, the need to hold accountable corporations that are violating on a daily basis Indigenous people rights and are the cause of the climate crisis we are facing today. Surya, Deva, as the UN Loss and Damage Fund is setting up, what do you think of reports recommendation, and what would be your recommendations to ensure a decolonial approach to the management of non-economic loss and damage?
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. So I will build on the recommendations in the report. I think there are 4 recommendations that Dela's report makes. I'll build on those recommendations and add a couple of those recommendations to decolonize the loss and damage fund. I mean, the starting point has to be the recognition of non-economic loss and damage, because the fund is, for now, on paper, fund recognizes, it includes non-economic loss and damage. But I think the key question is going to be how much money that the fund has or will have in future is going to go towards non-economic loss. So that issue is going to become very critical because the fund is likely to have limited resources. So that's my first point in terms of recognition, whether non-economic losses will achieve the same value and same weight as economic loss and damage. That's my first point. The second is contribution. It boils down to how much money we need. And of course, we need hundreds of billions dollars every year. What we have is less than 1% of what is needed. And that basically means that we need to apply more aggressively through all means, advocacy, litigation, the polluter pays principle. And that is the foundation of the colonial structure as well, because developed countries and the fossil fuel companies that have benefited for centuries from this particular emissions, they have to pay, in my view, to this loss and damage fund. And that has not happened enough. So I think we need to argue more and do more advocacy around that. We also need to bring in the CBDR principle, common but differentiated responsibilities. Even developing countries should contribute to the fund, in my view. They should not get a free check. that they can just get away with it. But of course, their responsibility should be not same in comparison to the historical polluters. But the other dimension of this contribution, in my view, is that we need to find innovative sources of funding. And that would entail imposing a global carbon tax, especially on fossil fuel companies, so whatever profit they make. And that funding has to go towards this loss and damage fund. But I would also go with the idea of taxing the super rich. G20 at one point of time was considering that. And I think we need to bring back this idea that the super rich individuals, corporate, most of them, these are business people, they have to be taxed because they are definitely benefiting, and they have benefited from the climate injustices. The third aspect is distribution and use. And I think the report mentions that in terms of the community-led approaches. So it's important we find local solutions rather than the solutions are not imposed top-down, bottom-up, community-led solutions. That's where culture becomes crucial. So what women would like, what indigenous peoples would like, what farmers and peasants would like in terms of the adaptation and mitigation or transformation. I think those voices have to be listened to very carefully. And finally, and that's also connected with what Krisda mentioned, remediation. The fourth aspect is remediation, because it is possible that some of the projects that are funded by the Loss and Damage Fund, they may also create other violations of human rights or the environment, potentially. And I think that is where we need a grievance mechanism, part of the fund that can handle those kind of complaints. I will stop here for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing those, and particularly for highlighting on your last point, the fact that, yes, measures that are presented to build solutions can sometimes be detrimental to the people that they claim to support. Now, Patricia, you are an important Indigenous feminist leader in our region and globally, who has been fighting to center community voices in climate action and policy. Your reflection will help us sum up the conversation and move the agenda forward. You've heard from Deva, Cressida, and Surya. What would you like to share on the reflection on the report and recommendations? And maybe can you draw a parallel between loss and damage caused by climate change and loss and damage linked to the energy transition?
Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Neïla, and everyone for inviting me to this space. I'm actually in a position where I have to reflect, provide reflections after such strong, powerful sets of speakers. So yeah, I've been even taking lots of notes here because there have been a lot and lots of reaffirmation, on some of the which are similar with some of the collective analysis of the ESCR-Net and its members across the globe. I think I'll start first with the report itself, and I couldn't reemphasize enough that the report has powerfully exposed how loss and damage is not only about economic destruction, but really about colonial annihilation of communities, cultures, lives, sovereignty, and try to expand the framing a little bit and draw this analysis, parallel analysis with the current narrative of just energy transition. So I would say first that the losses and damages caused by climate crisis and those driven by, in the name of energy transition, they are not separate. But I think what's really important for us to really look into here in our analysis that these two are connected by the same system of colonial extraction and corporate control. And this has been also reaffirmed by previous speakers. So in Asia and the Pacific, particularly, we have been witnessing and we continue to witness really dangerous trends where communities who have already suffering and continue to suffer from the impacts of rising seas, drought, extreme weather events, they are displaced again, they are dispossessed again by so-called solutions, be it nickel mining, industrial corridors, reclamation, carbon markets. So many of these projects, in different names, but then coming in a solution in the name of just transition. I want to also draw concrete examples that Manushya, had in its report, but also very, very much connected with ESCR-Net's analysis on energy transition, but also some of the reflection on development aggression. These are some of the points we have submitted also to Professor Surya Deva, and he did actually put out some of the elements from the report, which are very similar in his interventions before. So, for example, the Bajo and Vanuatu cases, and this is very much something, it was mentioned before, but I want to bring us to the Hongana Mayawa people in North Maluku. So they are an uncontacted indigenous communities in North Maluku, and now are facing dispossessions of their territory, cultural extinction, and really all health risks, because more than 19 mining companies under the leadership of Weda Bay Nickel, owned by Eramet of France, are operating on most of their territories, more than 40% of their territories. And these mining operations are justified in the name of clean energy, basically the nickel that will be produced for the EV batteries, the electronic vehicle batteries. And these projects are, violating their rights to self-determination, to free, prior, informed consent, and many more. Still in North Maluku, we did a research together with some of our partners also in the place in the country. There have been more than 23 times acute respiratory infections by indigenous communities in the place because, again, of the pollution coming from the nickel mining, the processing. As it was also said that, all these processings are also happening within the communities. Now the case in Bajo, in Vanuatu, but also in Manawa, they're all actually reflect relocation, ecological degradation that causes irreversible cultural loss. But again, for Bajo and Vanuatu, they're not necessarily coming in with the energy transition, but then exacerbated by the current climate crisis, right? In North Maluku, for example, it is very much because of the green extractivism marketed as climate action. Now I want to go to Papua New Guinea, what Cressida was mentioning about the Porgera mine. I just want to reaffirm again that it is not development. Yes, it is a colonial extractivism, again, wrapped in a gold wrapper, and violates indigenous sovereignty, commodified sacred land, the same thing that actually happened. So these extractivist approaches, and this also something that was dissected in the report, they're often conflated. They are packaged in different names, be it development, be it, clean development mechanism was there before, be it to transition away from the fossil fuel dependency, nature-based solutions. I think you may know better all of these names, right? But then the impacts are very similar. And I think one also element that I don't want to forget mentioning in Manushya's report about particular impact on women. In Indonesia, for example, women in North Kalimantan, they are faced by more than 30,000 hectares of industrial park projects. And these have been confronted, but then there are a lot of narratives say that no, it is not part of the Just Energy Transition Partnership that's led by the Global North countries, but it is when communities, when civil state organizations are trying to find and analyze and follow the money, it is coming from the $20 billion deal during G20 pact, between Indonesia and a number of leading countries, US, EU, Japan. So all of this, I think we need to also, put forward, because this narrative and is also echoing what Manushya Foundation said in your report, that women are disproportionately carry the burden, carry the emotional, ecological, and reproductive burdens. A number of questions that I want us to also question ourselves when we are told, and because there are a lot of manipulations happening in all these narratives, when we are told that it is a just quote unquote transition, what is it really about? When you're losing community lands for nickels, what is it really about? When women are losing water and access to their cultural practices, to their cultural zones? What is it about? What is just about worsening that burden and austerity measures that come with it? I think a number of these things are important, but also what I'm saying, the pattern of intensified militarism and militarization and surveillance of communities resisting green projects. So a number of things I think I want to encourage us to also think about, in our analysis on this non-economic loss and damage, and we are talking about it. So for ESCR-Net, we really believe that we must radically reframe this loss and damage into the harms that not only include, and caused by climate change, but also for solutions, but also all the extractivist approaches in the name or under the banner of green energy transition. Lastly, a couple of principles that we think it's also important, and I think some of these principles and demands have been mentioned before by previous speakers, but we do think that demilitarization and anti-corporate capture should be one thing that we want to really re-emphasize when we're talking about resisting against the impacts of loss and damage. Collective rights was already mentioned. I think it's very important because in a lot of conversations, recognition towards individual rights is one, but when it comes to collective rights, I think we need to really also strengthen our advocacy around that. Epistemic justice is another thing where we really center Indigenous communities, their knowledge, care and gender justice is another thing. And reparative and historical justice for us is also really important because when we're talking about addressing non-economic loss and damage, it requires, again, and I repeat, it requires reparations for historical and the ongoing harms that's happening. I think that would help me to also conclude with my part of recommendations. I just want to add to a number of things that I've said, and I couldn't agree more with all the things that I've said. But I also think that when we talk about non-economic loss and damage, the loss and damage fund, it really needs to be channeled to communities. And this is the conversation that is ongoing at the moment. But also, lastly, the rejection towards the militarism, militarization, divestment from military industry towards community-led solution must be also taken into account when we are addressing non-economic loss and damage. I think we cannot allow the transition or energy transition, just transition, whatever you name it, to become a smokescreen again for another dispossession disguised under its green banner. So if the transition causes more losses than it claims to solve, I think it is something that we can really see that it is not just. But again, it is simply another form of exploitation that repeating climate colonialism. I hope that I can be heard clearly, and thank you so much for the opportunity once again.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for sharing the example of Maluku. And yes, as you said, it's like we're talking about transition, energy transition, green transition. But in many cases, it seems like the packaging has changed. We put a little bit of green on it. But what's inside and what are the consequences on the ground are pretty much the same. So we are now coming to the end of our discussion. Thank you very much to our wonderful speakers for their sharp insights, and for the people following us. With this report, Manushya brings to the climate change discussion the key issue of decolonization and the urgent need to put vulnerable communities at the center of decision-making. I really hope that this conversation has inspired our audience to take action. The report is now accessible on our website. Please read it, share it, comment, talk about it, to ensure that the voices of those suffering the impact of climate change and those non-economic loss and damage lead the way toward a really just transition and inclusive climate action. Thank you very, very much again for all the speakers, for their insights, and I wish you all a great rest of the day. Thank you.